So, friends, we continue this journey with Jesus towards the cross, but also towards that empty tomb on Easter morning. And as we're on this journey, Jesus continues to tell us these kingdom stories. Jesus uses a series of parables to get our attention, to grab our imagination, to ask us to be thinking about what does God's kingdom look like and how does it come to life in the here and now, and where's God drawing us into that larger story and working in us and through us as God's kingdom comes to life. And so each week we're looking at different parts, or different ways of approaching God's kingdom with these kingdom stories that Jesus tells us. And as a way of working into today's message, I first want to ask you what comes to mind when you hear the word vocation. It's a word that we might think of purely in secular terms. We also might think of it in the context of a church. When you hear the word vocation, what comes to mind for you? What do you think of when you hear that word, vocation? Calling. Okay, and when you say calling, it's implied someone is calling. Who's implied to be calling? God. Okay, a calling from God. Thank you. All right. What else when you hear vocation? A job, right? Our job is a vocation, right? We have vocational school. You go to school to learn a vocation, all right? What else comes to mind when you hear vocation? Cindy? A way of living, okay? Not just a task or a calling, but a way of life, all right? I saw another hand over here, I thought, my periphery. Here we go. A passion. Okay, vocation may be a passion. All right, I love it. What else comes to mind when you hear vocation? Transition. Is that what you get? Micah said transition. Okay, sometimes that vocation, that calling is a movement from something towards something else, all right, or into something else. Okay? What do you got? Oh, she says, I think of Family Faith Night when we do invocation. Yeah, Family Faith Night, we do an invocation. An invocation is a call to worship. It's an invitation for God to come into the midst of what we're doing. And a vocation is also a way of saying, God, come and work through me. Come and be in what's happening right here. I like that. Great job. Any other thoughts about vocation? A more specific skill. So sometimes that idea of vocation is a kind of specific thing, a skill, a task that you perform or can do. All right? Well, let me unpack it in some bigger ways and give you some other pieces to think about. In some religious circles, vocation is thought of in a narrow kind of way, like if those of you that maybe grew up in a Catholic setting, a vocation is to be a priest. Someone who serves the church specifically, that is a kind of a very important specific vocation. When we think about vocation in a Lutheran sense, we think of the idea of the priesthood of all believers, that all of us have a calling from God. We all are given gifts to use and share. We all are called to be a part of what God's doing in the world. And that vocation, that calling, is unpacked in different ways. And so we may have specific gifts, like Doug said, a specific task, but it's a part of how we do life together, the vocation that we're given by God. And the vocations that we have, it could be our literal work that we go to each and every day. And within that work that we do is our calling and the ways that God is calling us to be a blessing, to touch the world using the gifts we've been given. Other times that vocation might just be the way we're called to be with the people we do life with. What is your vocation in your home? How are you called to live and move and breathe in that setting? And what is your vocation when you are out in the community or at school or at work? And then in the bigger sense, what does it mean as a faith community? What is the vocation that God's calling and drawing us into as God's kingdom comes to life and happens? Now, a couple other pieces around this to think about. We might say that vocation is God's call to engage in service and community. God's call to engage in service and community. Again, that could be any place in your life, but particularly we might think about it how we as a faith community engage in our vocation together. Frederick Buechner said this. He said that it's where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need. a way of looking at what are the needs in the world, and where do I find deep joy when I share, when I give what I have to give, where that intersection is where I might find a particular vocation that I'm called to live into. Author and minister Howard Thurman said, "Ask what makes you come alive and go do that. What the world needs is people who have come alive." I like that idea. How is God coming alive in us? For us as believers, it's the Holy Spirit that gives us life, that animates us. And so what is it as we live out our faith that helps us come alive? The world needs more of that. Go do that. Do that thing. So I guess what I'm asking you to today is to have an expansive view of what vocation might mean. But in this parable that Jesus tells us today about the kingdom, he's going to use the imagery of a vineyard. And in sort of in the classical Jewish mindset, often a vineyard represented the people of Israel. It represented God's people. So for us today, we could say that represents the church, or the ways that we as believers function together so that God's kingdom comes to life. So Jesus tells this parable today about a vineyard, and really what I want you to focus on is the owner of the vineyard. And we're gonna name this owner the generous owner of the vineyard. And then I want you to think about where you fit into this parable. Where are you in this story? Where are you in this cast of workers who come to be a part of what's happening? So let's begin in chapter 20 of Matthew's Gospel. And this is Jesus speaking, and he says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like the landowner who went out early one morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay the normal daily wage and sent them out to work. At 9 o'clock in the morning, he was passing through the marketplace and saw some people standing around doing nothing. So he hired them, telling them he would pay them whatever was right at the end of the day. So they went to work in the vineyard. And at noon, and again at 3 o'clock, the owner did the same thing." So let's just set the stage here. So he goes out early in the morning. This is, first thing, probably 6 a.m., and he goes to find workers for the day who's going to come work in the vineyard. He's got a ready group. They jump on board, and he agrees with them, "I'll pay you the normal daily wage to come and do this work that needs to be done in the vineyard," okay? But as the day goes on, he goes back through the town square and notices other folks who aren't actively working. He says, "Hey, come on and work for me, and I'll give you whatever's right at the end of the day." So we want to pay attention to a couple things. The folks that agree to the beginning of the day say, "Yep, we're going to work a normal full day, and we'll get paid a normal full day's wage." Sounds good. Comes back, picks up others later in the day, says, "We'll make it right at the end of the day. According to, we're going to make this right at the end of the day." And everybody's on board with what's happening here. Okay. Well, then things are going to get a little interesting. There's something else that happens here. But what I want you to notice about the landowner is he's going through town. He sees people that aren't using their gifts. He says, "Hey, why don't you come and join me in what we're up to here? Come and be a part of it." Okay? So as we go on, then we read in verse 6, "At 5 o'clock that afternoon, he was in town again and saw some more people standing around. He asked them, 'Why haven't you been working today?' And they replied, 'Because no one hired us.' The landowner told them, 'Then go out and join the others in my vineyard.' That evening, he told the foreman to call the workers in and pay them, beginning with the last workers first." Okay, so we set the stage. Finally, the last group he gets at 5 o'clock. So this is, the day's almost to an end. They get this last group to come in. He doesn't even say anything to them about pay at that point. He says, "Obviously, you need something to do. Why don't you come and do it with me and my people? That would be great." Invites them to come and be a part of what's happening. So now imagine the lineup, right? Everybody's called in. Workday's done. You can imagine the people that started at 6 a.m., they put in a full day's work. They are done. They're tired. They're worn out. But boy, they had a good full day's work. Everybody else, so they all line up, and the boss said, "Okay, I want you to start with the 5 o'clock people. Pay them first, and then everybody else." So if you were one of the people who came to work, what are you expecting to be paid for the work that's been done? What makes sense? Not a trick question. Hourly wage, right? Like, obviously, you're going to get paid for the work that was done. And so the people that came at 5 o'clock should be expecting an hour or two or whatever, right? Okay. So we're all on board with that. Everybody's ready to be paid. And then we read in verse 9, when those hired at 5 o'clock were paid, each received a full day's wage. Now, pause there. If you know how this ends, just forget that. So we're getting there, but let's pause it at this moment. At this moment, we don't know how this story ends yet. First people in line, they get full day's paycheck. And your workers who started earlier, first of all, how are these people reacting here? How are the 5 o'clock people reacting? Holy buckets! Okay, and what's the perception of the landowner at that point in time? This guy's awesome. That's the kind of boss I want to work for. Well, if I come at 5 o'clock, that's who I want to work for. But anyway, okay. And all right, at the same time, so if you're the other people in line, you've worked longer, what are you thinking as you just watch the boss, like this generous guy, like, here you go? What are you thinking or hoping? This could get really good for all of us, right? Like, at this point, all we know is that this guy's generous and this is looking good for everybody. Okay, so, right, you see where this is going probably. So what happens next? In verse 10, when those hired first came to get their pay, they assumed they would receive more, but they too were paid a day's wage. When they received their pay, they protested to the owner, those people who worked only 1 hour, and yet you've paid them just as much as you paid us who worked all day in the scorching heat. Okay, who relates to that reaction? How we feel about it? Boo! Probably, at least, right? But what has changed here? We paused it a moment ago and we were all like, yeah, this guy's awesome. He's so generous. And now we got to these folks and what's the reaction? Dude, that's not fair. What's wrong with you? Right? So what does he say? He answered one of them, friend, I haven't been unfair. Didn't you agree to work all day for the usual wage? Take your money and go. I wanted to pay this last worker the same as you. Is it against the law for me to do what I want with my money? Should you be jealous because I'm kind to others? And then Jesus wraps this up with this phrase. He says, so those who are last now will be first then, and those who are first will be last. So Jesus tells this parable that leaves everybody going, wait a second, I'm not sure how I feel about this. And then he says this last statement to really get people going, wait, what? And see, as Jesus tells these parables, he's always trying to get us to think. He wants us to think. He wants us to ask questions. He wants us to wonder, what do you mean? And part of this is to help us realize that God does not function on the same wavelength that all of us people do. God is not a human being person who thinks exactly like people do. We tend to want God to be just like us. And I hope God's more than just like us, right? But Jesus wants us to be asking these questions about what God's doing in the world and what God's kingdom looks like. And so we hear this last question, should you be jealous because I'm kind to others? So what's this all about? I want to ask you for a moment to think with me. I want you to imagine someone in your life who means a lot to you, who is far away from God. And I'm not asking you to make a judgment about that. I'm just asking you in your life, someone who's important to you who feels a long ways from God. Okay. Now, you got that person in mind. Now I want you to imagine that moment when we get to the end of our lives and God says, welcome home. And God says to that person, yeah, come on in. There's room for you here too. It's not too late. Now, how do you feel about that generosity right now? Okay? That's what God's talking about. God is not fair. If God was fair, first of all, none of us would get in. Okay, we all need to acknowledge that first of all. If my salvation was based on how good of a person I am, I mean, sure, there's good things that I do, but I'm a broken sinner just like y'all. And at the end of the day, there's no hope for us in that. No, the generous landowner is a God who says, yeah, there's still, it's not too late. there's still time for you to get in on this. There's still room for you here. So I want you to start in that place before we get on our human ideas of what's fair and just. Thank goodness God is not fair and just. Thank goodness our God is a God who's overflowing with mercy and grace and love. Thanks be to God. But now let's talk about some other pieces here, because it would be easy for us to fall into this idea of, oh, right. So then you're saying, Pastor Rob, it doesn't really matter what we do with our lives. We can just, at the end say, hey, God, you still got room for me? And there we go. So now we talk about this idea of vocation. So sit with me here for a moment. When you're doing the thing that God created you to do, when you are giving life to this world, when you are blessing others, what do you find in that? Is there some worth there? Is there some value there? Okay? I want you to think about this place. I want you to think about the relationships you have here. I want you to think about what happens at being a part of a faith community when you have people who really love you and care for you, when you have people you can lean on in the hardest times, and when you can be that for someone else. There's value there. And you know what? Our hearts, those of us who experience it, our hearts ache for those who don't we? 'Cause the landowner comes into town and he sees people not using their gifts, and it's not, hey, lazy person, get to work. That's not what we never heard him say that anywhere, did we? We never heard this landowner have any issue with anybody who wasn't yet put to work. So again, obviously this isn't about working or not working, right? But his issue was not, hey, why aren't you getting the job done? He saw somebody who was not using their gifts, and they were invited to use their gifts because he had a place for them in the vineyard. And there was a way for them to actively use the gifts they've been given to be a part of the beautiful thing that was happening. So let's imagine for a moment a vineyard. And actually, let's bring this to modern day. Let's say this is a winery. And what are some of the jobs that need to happen in a winery? What needs to happen there? What's that? Okay, we need harvesters. We need tasters. He's not wrong. What else do we need? Grape stompers, all right? Somebody's got to turn those grapes into wine, okay? Pruners. We need marketers. Financials. Transportation. Somebody's got to get those people to and from the parking lot. Fermentation process. What? Yes, bottlers. That's right. Right? Okay. Yep. And the marketing also goes along with what happens when it's active season. You got customers coming. You need greeters or welcomers. You need a whole staff to run the shop. Right? You've got all these groundkeepers that take care of things behind the scenes. So you get the idea, obviously. Man, there's a lot going on in that winery. There's a lot happening there. And it takes a lot of people using different gifts to make that happen, doesn't it? Okay. So now, Jesus, talking about God's kingdom, talking about the church, what does it take for it to be what God intends for it to be? It takes everybody using their gifts. And some people are doing financials, and some people are doing marketing, and some people are digging around in the dirt, and some people are stomping on grapes, and some people are tasting the wine, right? People are doing all the different things, but it takes people for all of them. And guess what? Every single role matters. And so when we talk about vocation, we're talking about God saying, and I need you, and I need you, and I need you, and I need you. It takes all of us together for this to be what God intends for it to be. And when we all come in and say, I'm going to give you what I can give, God says, yeah, and we're going to make some great tasting wine here. We're going to do some cool stuff here. Okay, right? And ultimately, that vineyard is about being a place that gives life. It gives life. It's a place where people gather. It's a place where people celebrate. It's a place where people experience life. So here we are as a congregation. And you know what? We've had some people working in these vineyards. I just somebody in our congregation, Ann Wick, sent me an article this week of when this church was built. In 1965, Ginny Nelson remembers because she was a part of the walk. How old were you, Ginny? Oh, she's not telling. She wasn't even born yet, but I promise you she was a part of it. Sorry, Jenny. But before this building, this church existed on Blue Mound Street on the northwest part of town. And in 1965, the people in this congregation walked from there to here and had their first worship service. Okay? Workers in the vineyard. Joyce? For those of you at home, Joyce Shep said, I was with Ginny on that walk, and if we have to do that the next time, I'm going to need some help. Help me out, she said. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know that I want to make that walk either, but we'll look into that, all right? Now, this transition that we're in is also not just about this building. This congregation is two churches that came together, also our building in Mazo, St. John's. And the same thing, generations of people working in the vineyard for God's kingdom to come to life. And in both of these faith communities and now our joint community together, God has done some incredible, wonderful things. And you know what? When it gets to the end of the day, those people that have been there from the beginning, God's so grateful that they've been digging in that dirt for as long as they've been digging in it. God is so grateful for the things that they have done to make that vineyard what it is. And you know, if you're one of those people who have been digging in that dirt for a really long time, there might be times where you say, I don't know how I feel about the people that are coming to work right now, because I've been here a long time doing the work, so what's that all about? We might feel that, right? That's a totally normal human thing to feel. And we all were in agreement with those people in the story that were like, this isn't cool. Sometimes that doesn't feel good when we've been given all that we can give. We've been serving, we've been given financial, we've been doing hard stuff, and then new people show up and they get to reap the rewards, it feels like. We say, what's that all about, right? And it's a reminder to us that all of this is normal human stuff. The bigger picture is God is at work here doing some beautiful things. And my goodness, look what's been done along the way. Look what God has done along the way. And those of us who came later to the story, we didn't get to enjoy the blessings of before we showed up, but boy, we're grateful to enjoy the blessings then now that we're here. And the next part of this story is what's yet to come. What is God going to do with his vineyard next? As we move to our new location and we're in a new space that truly is meant to bring the whole community in, what's going to happen there? And how are all of our gifts going to be used in that place? How is God going to work through us? And you know what? We might be somebody who's cleaning the bathrooms. Or we might be somebody who is doing the financials. Or somebody who is out in the middle of the night checking on the boiler to make sure the building's not freezing. Right? Who knows what we're going to be called to do? We may just be somebody who's at home quietly praying for their pastor. It's really appreciated, by the way. You see, there's no gifts that aren't important. It takes all of us. But that's what a faith community is all about. It's God using all of our little things and making something beautiful. We are a community who not only gives life to one another, but we give life outside of this place in really important ways. And so, friends, it may be getting late in the day, and there's people who aren't here yet, and God's saying, hey, why don't you come on in and be a part of it? And sometimes those new workers will come in and we'll be like, well, wait a second, like, you weren't here when we did all the other hard stuff. And I hope we can say, thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. So friends, we worship a generous God, a God whose mercy and grace is for all of us. And the benefits of faith, we get to experience the intangibles here and now, and we get to receive the eternal gift of God's mercy and grace. That's incredible stuff. But here and now, we're called to do this together. Thanks be to God that we're all invited and we all have a job to do. Let's pray. Oh, gracious God. We give you thanks for the ways that you are at work in our lives. And today we stop to give thanks for those who have done the work before us, or those who have long been at work, making room for us. God, today we give thanks for the gifts you give us to make a difference, the ways that you call us to be a blessing. We give thanks for the ways that you call us into what you are up to, that ultimately something beautiful can be made. God, as we make this, as we go through this time of transition and move to our new space, help us to take time to celebrate what you have done, to be present in what you are doing, and to look forward to what is yet to come. But God, may we please help us to be generous as you are, to be ready to welcome, to be ready to love, to be ready to point to you and to include others in on what you're up to. But help us to remember that you have work for us to do. And it's not to earn our way to anything, but actually, God, it's a blessing. It's a blessing to be invited into this work. So help us to joyfully do the work you've called us to. We pray these things in Jesus' name.